Hello everyone, JD here. This presentation is going to focus specifically on realism. It has two major components. The first is the central assumptions of realism, and then secondly, a case study that's called Proliferation and Arms Races, specifically looking at nuclear weapons. Before I go there, I just want to remind people of the strands of realism. If you look at the slides that I've prepared, you will note that there are four. Classical realism, neorealism, which is also referred to as structural realism. Then we have neoclassical realism and mercantilism. So please make sure you familiarize yourself with those. Now, when you're looking specifically at the central assumptions, I want to get to the first part of this, and the reason why I'm doing this presentation for everyone is we've got four central assumptions we want to talk about. The first of which is states are the principal actors and each enjoys sovereignty. We say principal actors. As a political entity, states make decisions. And when we say that, we really mean the government within the state makes decisions, because not everybody, it depends on the kind of system you have, but not everyone, even in a democratic republic, not everyone is directly involved in that decision-making process. So it's really the political leaders of that country, the people who serve in, or the personnel of government making decisions. They compose, and I say that they're part of that. And certainly the state, then they make decisions on behalf of that country. And we say each enjoys sovereignty. The people who live within that state, within its geopolitical boundaries, get to decide what kind of system they're going to have, right? The second point is states exist in a self-help system of anarchy where survival is the top priority. In other words, you have to look out for your own interests in a world where there are other people, some of which you might get along with, others you might not get along with very well. And I think that, when they say anarchy, really, yes, we do institute laws. We do have laws within countries, and then we have rules that govern the interaction between countries. But nothing's to say that people won't violate that, because there have been wars historically. And that's really tied to the next point. States are disposed towards conflict rather than cooperation. In other words, it's not about country A trying to get along with country B, as much as it could be country B trying to edge out country A for certain resources. In other words, it wants to advance its own interests. B wants to advance its own interests at the expense of A, and that's going to lead to conflict. Conflict can manifest in a variety of different ways. It could manifest in war, where there's open hostility. It also could manifest in, for example, trade, when you think about tariffs and so forth. But I don't want to get lost in the weeds. I just want to focus specifically on the assumptions, each of them. So states are disposed towards conflict rather than cooperation. In other words, you're going to find yourself at odds with other people in this global community at some point. And then finally, states are unitary rational actors. By themselves, they make decisions to advance their own interests that sometimes correspond with the interests of others, but there might be many occasions where it really is to the detriment of others, and that's tied to the third point with the conflict. When we say we're a rational actor, think about this. Every state needs resources to operate, right? We have economies. And also, we're concerned about the influence that one country might have in a region of the world, or what influence your country might have, or how much influence another country might have over different players in this global community. But what I want to say here is, when you say states are unitary rational actors, they make decisions that are calculated. In other words, we know what we need, we know what we want, and we know what steps we're willing to take in order to get that, to satisfy. So states do this all the time, right? There's a military facet of this, there's a trade facet of this, and certainly it could be ideological. I think about the Cold War, for example, in a historical sense. And really, the Cold War, you could say pre-1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved. But I'm thinking out loud here. I think about, well, do you want to have a democratic republic with a capitalist economy? Or do you want to have an autocratic dictatorial government that's communist in its orientation? And that was really, I think, an ideological struggle between superpowers. All right. But I don't want to, once again, I want to stay focused on this. I want to talk a bit about the case study now. proliferation and arms races. So I have these notes that I prepared. Classical realists would argue that the United States would abrogate the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty due to self-help system and the need to build one's capabilities. All right, so we're talking here about proliferation arms races. Structural realists would add that it is not absolute power that matters, but relative capabilities of the United States and Russia. In other words, we have two countries that have stockpiled nuclear weapons. This goes back to the Cold War, and we still have quite a few of them. And when we say, it used to be the former Soviet Union, now we're talking specifically about Russia. Now, Russia does have an influence over other countries, but we're going to focus and specifically say Russia, and then the United States. Both seek a favorable balance of power and see the INF Treaty as an impediment. In 2014, the U.S. accused Russia of violating the terms of the treaty. And I'm actually going to post information in the description below if you want to go and read more about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Okay, so in 2014, the U.S. accused Russia of violating the terms by developing weapons. And in 2017, asserted Russia had deployed such weapons, such as the 9M729. One of the perils of entering a treaty with a rival is the possibility that they might cheat or defect from the agreement. The only option to rebalance the level of power is to abrogate the treaty and develop a weapon itself. So think about it like this. If two countries, in this case the United States and Russia, come to the table and say, we want to find a way to, you think about it. I remember this bumper sticker that used to say, the arms race has no winners. Meaning you can keep stockpiling weapons, but why do you have these weapons? At some point you might want to use them against each other. And if you use them, that means nuclear annihilation. So naturally countries, it's in their own self-interest to not cease to exist. They're going to want to come to the table, the bargaining table, and sit down and talk. You can work out a treaty. A treaty is an agreement between two countries, and the countries have formally accepted it, right? And so in this particular instance, if you say we're going to keep certain weapons and maybe dismantle others, or if we're going to not add to our stockpiles or develop new weapons, then it's kind of this, I don't know, there's kind of an honor system of sorts there, meaning if we're not going to do it, we assume you're not going to do it. But if the other country starts doing it, then we feel we need to develop another weapon so that we can keep the balance. But you notice what happens. If the United States has a certain number and kind of nuclear weapons, and Russia has a certain number and kind of nuclear weapons, and they start developing more, then we'll feel the need to develop more on our side in order to keep the balance. But where does that end? Because at some point, you can end up with distrust between the countries, and then it can, unfortunately, I think, I don't want to say spiral out of control, because that isn't what I think would happen, nor that's not what has happened historically. But I think that it can create increased tension, certainly increased tension, because I think most people don't want to die in a nuclear blast. I think it's fair enough to say. All right, structural realists one of the perils of entering a treaty with a rival is a possibility that they might cheat or defect from the agreement. That's the point I'm making here. So structural realists note that the U.S. might increase its capabilities or find itself at a disadvantage, need to deploy weapons within a striking distance. So Russia also sees the INF Treaty as a roadblock to its security interests. It accused the United States of violating the terms. So we accuse them, they accuse us. Claims center on the U.S. deployment of components of a missile defense system in Eastern Europe, known as the Mark 41 vertical launch system. So that's what Russia was upset with us about. Okay, although Washington claims that they're only for defensive purposes, Moscow insists the technology can be used for offensive purposes. Also charged that some U.S. drones meet the specifications of banned missiles. So lastly here, calculation is the same as that made by the U.S. Relative balance favors the U.S. So this goes back to what I was saying. If country A has, or the United States has certain weapons, and Russians have certain weapons, and then they start building new ones and deploy them, and we start building new ones and deploy them, we can each point at each other and say, well, you're violating the terms of the treaty. And this is known to happen. Okay? So that's that. So This gets more complicated, though. The U.S. and Russia are concerned about China. Current nuclear arsenal is comprised mostly of missiles that fall within range, prohibited by the INF Treaty, and they've invested large sums in developing what's called the DF-26. The Chinese have. Analysts believe that the weapon has a range of approximately 2,500 miles. China is not party to the INF Treaty, thus not in violation of its terms. So China's operating outside of the boundaries of that treaty, or the bounds of the treaty. Okay. Beijing has expressed no interest in becoming a member if the terms were renegotiated, and I'm not surprised by this. I mean, if you're thinking like the Chinese government, why would you want to join a treaty that would ultimately tie your hands and would keep you from being able to develop new weapons? Because if you're looking to advance your interests and you want to develop more power on a global scale, you want the ability to develop these weapons, and you're not going to sign on to a treaty that could limit you or your ability to do such, right? Okay, so that's that. China possesses intercontinental missiles capable of striking the U.S. mainland, but the U.S. has its own intercontinental missiles arsenal to act as a deterrent. So there is a bit of a balance there too. Although I'd have to look up how many each country has. All right, North Korea's nuclear program and the desire of the United States and others to stop it adds another dimension to this argument. So now we bring in North Korea. And North Korea, there's a concern there, right? The U.S. withdrawal from the INF Treaty sends a signal to the North Korean regime. The failure to denuclearize is unacceptable and will lead the U.S. to surround your country with intermediate nuclear weapons. Dismantle your nuclear program, that's a priority. The lack of organizational mechanisms is adequate to adequately control their newly acquired weapons. The risk is too great. Okay, so we say here, dismantling the nuclear program. It's a priority. Why is it a priority? Because the lack of organizational mechanisms to adequately control their newly acquired weapons is too great of a risk, meaning we are worried. The United States, and not just the United States. Okay. Offensive realists believe that more power is always better. States should seek to maximize power and always increase gains relative to others. According to realists, an arms race is the consequence of states existing in a system of anarchy. If states do not protect themselves and promote their own survival, no one else will do it for them. So for the political theorists out there, it's like the state of nature, for people who've taken my political theory class. Arms must be developed and deployed. The endeavors for security will create insecurity in others. In other words, if you have weapons that they don't have, then you have leverage that they don't have. And that gives you security and puts them in a more insecure position. Tension, hostility, mistrust can grow and eventually explode into conflict. Yes, it is possible. Although during the Cold War, the United States and the former Soviet Union were able to manage that. There are times where really serious concerns, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union wanted to put weapons in Cuba, which is just 90 miles off of the U.S. coast. But they were able to de-escalate that. All right, and lastly, I want to say it is unclear whether arms control treaties control this phenomenon. In other words, you think about it, it might give you some sense of or peace of mind to negotiate a treaty with another country, but the question is, will people adhere to it? Because if they don't, then what good is it? All right, that's where I'm going to end. I want to thank you for listening. Make sure you take a look at the description section below the video because there are some hyperlinks you can go if you'd like to read more. Specifically, I'm going to put the information in there, as I said, about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, as well as other articles, because that treaty, if I'm not mistaken, is dated to 1987, and a lot's happened since 1987. And I'm also going to put some news articles and other materials, and I've got some nonprofit organizations, some information down there, so you can go and read from a variety of credible sources to learn more about proliferation and arms races as it relates to this moment. Thank you for listening. Peace.